Panic buttons and pixels. A look back at the great video game scare of the 1980s. Remember the 1980s? It was a time of big hair, bold fashion, and the birth of a new form of entertainment that would change the world forever. Leg warmers, shoulder pads, and a whole lot of hairspray. The decade was iconic for its unique style and cultural shifts. Oh yeah, and the great video game panic. This was a time when arcades were the social hubs for kids and teens, and home consoles were becoming household staples. That's right, folks, back in the day, video games weren't just a fun way to spend an afternoon. They were a menace to society. At least that's what some people thought, or at least that's what some people wanted you to believe. News reports and community meetings were filled with heated debates about the dangers of these new digital pastimes. Imagine this: parents, politicians, and even some psychologists freaking out over pixelated plumbers and space invaders. They were convinced that these games were corrupting the youth. They claimed these digital diversions were turning our youth into joystick-wielding zombies, primed for violence and societal collapse. The fear was palpable and widespread. It sounds ridiculous now, right? But back then the fear was very real for many people. But the 1980s were a different time. A time when new technology was often met with suspicion and misunderstanding. The rise of home consoles and arcade cabinets brought video games into the mainstream, and with that came a wave of fear and misunderstanding. People were unsure of how these games would impact their children and society at large. So, buckle up as we journey back to the decade of Neon and Nintendo, exploring the absurd claims, the political battles, and the lasting impact of the great video game scare of the 1980s. We'll dive into the controversies, the media frenzy, and how it all shaped the future of gaming. Setting the stage: Pac-Man fever and the dawn of a digital age. To understand the video game panic, we need to rewind a bit. The 1980s were a transformative decade, a time when technology began to infiltrate everyday life in unprecedented ways. The 1980s were a time of rapid technological change. Personal computers were no longer just the domain of scientists and hobbyists, they were becoming household items. Personal computers were becoming more common, and with them the first glimpses of the digital age. Families were starting to see the potential of these machines, not just for work, but for entertainment and education. Video games were at the forefront of this revolution. Arcades became the new social hubs where kids and teens gathered to compete and have fun. Arcades popped up like mushrooms after a digital rain, offering kids and teens a chance to blast aliens, munch dots, and rescue princesses, all for $0.25 a pop. These places were vibrant, noisy, and full of life. At home, Atari and Nintendo consoles brought the arcade experience into living rooms, introducing iconic characters like Mario and Donkey Kong. These consoles were game changers, literally and figuratively. These games weren't just a fleeting fad, they were a cultural phenomenon. They influenced fashion, music, and even language, embedding themselves deeply into the fabric of society. But this new form of entertainment came with a hefty dose of anxiety. As with any new technology, there were fears and misunderstandings. Parents worried about the addictive nature of these games, fearing their kids would choose joysticks over textbooks. Concerns about the impact on children's health and academic performance were rampant. The Cold War was still simmering, and some saw video games, with their focus on space battles and high scores, as promoting aggression and militaristic thinking. The imagery of conflict and competition was hard to ignore. The cultural landscape was ripe for a moral panic, and video games became the perfect target. They were new, they were popular, and they were misunderstood, making them an easy scapegoat for broader societal anxieties. Enter the moral guardians, surgeons, psychologists, and the crusade against joysticks. It wasn't just worried parents raising eyebrows at Pac-Man and his pixelated pals. The 1980s saw a wave of concern sweeping across various professional fields, each with their own take on the supposed dangers lurking within these arcade cabinets. A chorus of self-proclaimed experts emerged, eager to share their often dubious findings on the dangers of video games. These experts appeared on TV shows, in newspapers, and at conferences, each presenting their alarming research. Leading the charge was Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, a man more accustomed to warning about the dangers of smoking than battling digital Donkey Kongs. Koop's involvement lent a veneer of credibility to the growing panic. Coop famously declared video games a health hazard, claiming they were as addictive as heroin and could lead to a generation of isolated, aggressive youth. His statements were widely publicized, adding fuel to the fire of public concern. Psychologists weren't far behind, offering their own diagnoses. They conducted studies and published papers, each more sensational than the last, warning of the psychological impacts of prolonged gaming. Space Invader Syndrome and Pac-Man fever became popular terms describing a range of symptoms from eye strain and carpal tunnel to, wait for it, increased aggression and criminal tendencies. These terms were catchy and made for great headlines. The media, always eager for a good scare story, lapped it up. News anchors delivered these reports with grave seriousness, further stoking the flames of fear and uncertainty among the public. News reports featured pixelated villains alongside real-life criminals, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. This conflation made it easy for the public to believe that video games were a direct pathway to delinquency. Video games weren't just entertainment, they were a threat to the very fabric of society. Parents, educators, and lawmakers rallied together, calling for stricter regulations and even outright bans on these digital diversions. Congressional showdowns and arcade anxiety when video games went to Washington. The video game panic reached fever pitch in 1982 when the issue landed in the hallowed halls of Congress. The Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency held hearings on the alleged dangers of video games and their potential to corrupt America's youth. These weren't your typical dry policy debates. The hearings featured a colorful cast of characters, from concerned parents and educators to the president of Atari, who found himself defending Pac-Man against accusations of promoting violence. One of the most memorable moments came when a psychologist presented a study claiming that playing Pac-Man caused increased aggression in children. The study involved watching children play a completely different game, one that didn't even exist. Despite the lack of solid evidence and the often absurd claims, the hearings had a lasting impact. They legitimized the fears surrounding video games and paved the way for attempts to regulate